Hello and welcome back to Christie's Cozy Corner. And it is almost Valentine's Day, which means of course I have to make this video about my favorite romantic subplots in fantasy. And this is probably the kind of video that you're going to be seeing in a lot of different places, especially around this time of year, but still, I just wanted to talk about my personal favorite. So I have 7 different books/series that I will be recommending today, and these both fall under the category of my favorite romantic subplots in fantasy, as well as these are my favorite fantasies with romantic subplots. And the way that I'm going to be structuring this video is that I'll be going in the order of most romance heavy to least romance heavy, with maybe the exception of the first 2 books. And the first few books that I'm going to talk about can basically be considered fantasy romance, and as I progress, each book will have less and less of a focus on romance until it really is just like a very light subplot. And when I talk about a romantic subplot, I'm not just talking about like characters that just get into a relationship or characters that are in relationships in general. I'm talking about the ones where you really ship these characters and are actively rooting for them to get together. And there's also like an element of will they, won't they, and like the kind of romantic tension that gives you butterflies in your stomach and makes your heart squeeze in the best way possible. So starting with the first series on this list, we have Awakens by Elise Kova. This is a young adult fantasy romance, and I'm specifically talking about the first book in this series because that is the one that I really liked. Admittedly, I did not continue with the series past the second book, but I really feel like the first one can just be read as a standalone. And the story is about a girl named Vala who is an apprentice in the royal library, and one day the crown prince gets gravely injured and the whole castle is tasked to try to find a way to save him. So Vala ends up being the one to do it, and in that process, completely by accident because of some magical things that happen, she ends up being magically tied to the prince that she saved, Prince Aldrich. And as a result of this, it is discovered that Vala herself has some magical abilities as well. And sorcerers in this world are very feared and prejudiced against, and she wants absolutely nothing to do with them. But leaving her magic unchecked and untrained can be dangerous not only to herself, but the people around her. So she is soon thrust into the world of the sorcerers that is led by the Prince Aldrich. And I admit in this one, the story and magic is pretty generic because the magic system, first of all, is just your basic elemental magic system. So you have water, air, fire, and earth. And you also have this young girl who falls for the dark and brooding prince. So it's really all something that we've seen before. In fact, it's actually pretty cliche, but sometimes that is just exactly what you crave, you know? But that's also just what makes it so nostalgic and comforting because you know what to expect and you know like all the familiar beats that it's going to follow. So I still ended up having a really good time with this one regardless because I knew what to expect going in, and that ended up being exactly what I got. And also I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm immune to the brooding, suffering love interest, and I liked it for how cliche it was and how it was just angsty in all the right places because you have these 2 characters who are so different in their stations in life, and so there's that element of star-crossed lovers where they want to be together but they can't, and one might say that, you know, there is like a difference in power dynamic there, but for me it was just adding more to that like forbiddenness of the romance. And I also really liked how they became friends first and then eventually started to develop feelings for each other from there, but then neither of them could admit their feelings for each other because then it would just complicate things and neither one knew how the other one felt, and it's just such a classic dynamic. So, you know, if you're in the mood for like a classic YA fantasy time, then this one is definitely it. I will give fair warning though that there is a little bit of an element of not like other girls about Vala, so just be aware of that going in. And like I also said, I only read the first 2 books of this series. I DNF'd the series after the second one because in the second one it was just going in a direction that was a little bit too angsty and repetitive for my liking, and I felt like I already got everything that I wanted from the story. So I still think it's perfectly okay to just read the first book and stop there because this first book will just check all of those boxes that you're looking for. And the next book on this list is A Marvellous Light by Freya Marsk, and this one is basically also a fantasy romance but in a historical setting and has a wider mystery plot as well. And this is set in Edwardian times and is about our main character Robin, who has just landed a new job in this government position, but due to an administrative error, this seemingly mundane position ends up turning out to be the liaison to the magical society in this world. And being someone who had no idea that magic even existed, Granted, this obviously ends up being quite a big shocker to Robin. So his entire world is upended by the discovery of this knowledge, and he also ends up contracting a life-threatening curse as well. So he must team up with Edwin, his magical counterpart at this new job, to find a way to break this curse and save his life. And there's also an added mystery of what happened to his predecessor, the man who previously held this position, and what danger has Robin wrapped himself into. So the romance in this book is between Robin and Edwin, and they have very much a grumpy sunshine dynamic, with Robin being the sunshine and Edwin being the grump, which I absolutely adored. And I love romance, okay? And I want to read more romance, but my problem is that I just haven't really found a lot that I can really say that I love. And I think my main issue there is because in a lot of the romances that I have read, I just don't really care about the characters, and so if I'm not invested in the characters, then I also don't really care about the progression of their romance and relationship. But this book definitely does not have that problem, and that is why it's one of my favorite fantasy romances, because I love how you get focused on both Robin and Edwin, and it lets us know who they are as people and lets us see the struggles that they each individually go through. And it focused on them as individuals first, so by the time the romance starts to develop, I'm actively rooting for them to get together, and I care about wanting to see their romance together. And then at that point, then it was really great to see them open up to one another and care for each other and learn how to work through their problems together. And I especially loved Edwin, the aforementioned grump, in this dynamic. He's very cold and prickly in the beginning, but as we learn more about him, we learn about what made him like this, and as the relationship develops, we see him warming up to Robin and slowly opening up his heart and learning to be vulnerable. And in this first book, which is the first book of a trilogy, this one follows Robin and Edwin's story, whereas the next two books in this series follows their own individual couples, and all the while the bigger plot is focused on the mystery that is happening in this magical society. The next series on this list is the Daevabad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty, starting with the first book, City of Brass. Now this is kind of where we start to slip away from the romance and focus more on the fantasy, with the romance just as a subplot. So this series follows our main character Nahri, who is a con artist in Cairo, Egypt, and in her latest con, she ends up accidentally summoning up a jinn, and thus revealing that Nahri herself is also part jinn. And so she gets taken away to the magical city of Daevabad, where all the jinn reside, and where her existence itself throws the entire politics of that world into turmoil. And I just finished the final book of this trilogy last month, and it has definitely gone down as one of my favorites, not just as a fantasy with a romantic subplot, but just fantasy in general. And I'm not going to say who the romances are between, because there are a couple of potential romances, and there's a lot of like will they, won't they's, and you really don't know like who's going to end up together in the end. So there's all that added tension and intrigue, and part of the fun is in the not knowing. And while I don't think that these romances are necessarily written for these tropes, it does still hit on a number of tropes that I personally really enjoy. Like you kind of have this royal and guard dynamic, and friends to lovers, and star-crossed lovers, and forbidden romance, and just like all that good stuff. So I definitely love the romances in this series, but that is not all. I also really love the world and the plot as well. The city of Daevabad is just so incredibly magical, and the writing describing the world and atmosphere and food is just so lush and colorful and transportive. And also the political intrigue is so good, because within Daevabad you have multiple different kinds of tribes of jinn, and one of these tribes rules over the other, and you also have some others that are very oppressed but trying to garner more power. And the politics of this world are really just balancing on a knife's edge. And you also just really care for these individual characters as well, because each of them have their own struggles to contend with. Like you have Nahri, who believed for her entire life that she was just a regular human girl, and now suddenly she is thrust into this world that is completely new to her, and where her presence itself threatens to tip the very delicate balance within it. And then you have this other character who has committed very atrocious acts in the past, but by following orders and in the name of those in power that he was loyal to. And then this other character who is part of the tribe that is in power, but he sees the brutality that is inflicted on those that are being oppressed, and he wants to do his best to help, but somehow just keeps making everything worse. So you follow each of these character stories and you really root for them. And then with this added romantic element as well that no way detracts from the rest of the plot in the story, it just makes everything even better. And the next book on this list is Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries by Heather Fawcett, part of the Emily Wilde series. And this is a series that I have talked about quite extensively on my channel, especially in the last few videos, so I will try not to sound too repetitive, although I probably will end up being quite repetitive. So this series is about Emily Wilde, who's a Cambridge professor conducting research on fairies, or the fae folk, and there are a wide variety of them in the world, from brownies to the high fae, and so Emily is trying to put together an encyclopedia documenting all the different types. And in this first book, she travels to a region to do research on a specific kind of fae that is not very well known. And it's supposed to be a solo trip, but then her colleague and fellow Cambridge professor decides to tag along, the insufferable but charming Wendell Bambleby, who also happens to be the love interest. And this book is very much focused on Emily and her research, and is told through a series of journal entries from Emily's perspectives as she documents her process. But the dynamic between her and Bambleby is definitely what makes this series so great for me and why I love it so much, especially seeing how much they love to push each other's buttons on purpose, and the banter and bickering between the two of them, because on one hand you have Emily, who is very focused on her research and takes it very seriously, but then you have Bambleby, who is just like very la-di-da about the whole thing. But then Bambleby is also very particular about cleaning and keeping things organized, whereas Emily could not care less about that. So it ends up causing a lot of like arguments and fun interactions between the two of them, and even though they could not be more opposite from one another, they still work together so well and genuinely care for each other. And the best part of all is how obsessed Bambleby is with Emily. Like, he is obsessed. And I don't mean that in like the jealous, possessive alpha male kind of way, because I very much do not enjoy that. But Bambleby just worships Emily and respects her so much, and I love them together. Now for this next series, if there's any recommendation that you take from this video, please let it be this one, and that is The Emperor's Edge by Lindsay Buroker. This is a self-published fantasy series, and I'm on a mission to get more people to read it, especially if you are someone who likes slow burn, because this series has literally the best slow burn that I have ever read, and I stand by that statement. And the main series is 7 books long, along with some short stories and novellas. So when I say slow burn, I mean slow burn. So this series is about our main character Amaranth, who gets accidentally wrapped up in a plot to kill the emperor. And so now she is trying to clear her name while also trying to save said emperor. And along the way, she also recruits some other individuals and forms a team together, including the legendary assassin Sicarius. And from the synopsis and overall premise of the book, it's quite obvious who the romantic interest is going to be, so I'm not going to hide that at all. Of course, it's Sicarius. And the thing that I love the most about this series is that the romantic subplot does not get in the way of the wider plot in any way. Like, Amaranth and Sicarius are fully aware of their mission and know what they need to achieve, and know that the bigger plot is bigger than just the two of them. So they have this mutual understanding that that is the #1 priority, and whatever is forming between the two of them can wait and come later. But of course, that doesn't stop the occasional stolen glances and moments of sexual tension, and that is what I love the most about a good slow burn, is like all these little moments and hints of things, like the crumbs that just leave you wanting more. And in my opinion, that is always so much more appealing than like a full-blown romance. I don't know if that's just me. But of course, I love the romance between these two characters because I actually like them individually as characters first. And it's also once again a grumpy sunshine dynamic where you have Amaranth, who is the sunshine and is just such a delight of a character. The way that she is able to slowly coax Sicarius from his dark, broody shell with her teasing and charm. And yes, of course, Sicarius is the dark, broody kind of assassin, but I feel like he is so much better than your typical assassin characters that you read a lot of the times, because he doesn't have that like try-hard edginess to him that I feel like is so common in this archetype. Like, instead, he is very level-headed and pragmatic and capable and focuses on getting the job done in the most efficient way possible. And it's quite funny because that does become a point of contention between him and Amaranth pretty often, because she's like, you can't just kill people whenever you want, even if they are trying to kill us first. Like, we are trying to exonerate ourselves. and clear our names. This is not helping that cause. So then we get to see Sakarya slowly start to learn better ways of handling these situations from Amaranth. So it ends up making for some really fun interactions, and the banter between them as well as the rest of the team is just top notch. And the next series on this list is the Rook and Rose trilogy by M.A. Carrick, starting with this first book, The Mask of Mirrors. And now this is where we truly get into the subplot territory, because this series is very much plot oriented and the romance just like happens to be there and develop. So this series takes place in a city called Nadezhra and is ruled by these elite families and houses. And the main character, Ren, along with her sister, are both con artists, and they are trying to trick their way into the family registry of one of these houses. And there are a lot of politics at play, with people forming alliances with one another or double-crossing others to achieve their goals. And the two magic systems in this series are also really interesting because, yes, there are two. The first one, called Numenatria, is based on astronomy, and the second one, called Patterning, is very much like dream magic and based on tarot card reading. So it's also really cool in this series to see how each of them work, and the world building is actually quite impressive. And the romances in this book, again, it's one that I can't really say who it's in between because you really don't know. You really don't know. But there are certainly ones that you are rooting for, or at least I am rooting for, because it is a trilogy and I've only read the first two books. I still have to read that last and final book. But it's also a very queer normative world, so you can literally ship anyone together if you wanted. And that's just another one of my favorite things about this series. Like, you have this ensemble cast where anyone can just be shipped with anybody else, and the potential and possibilities are endless. And again, there's just enough hints at romances to get you hooked and get you invested and just be like, yes, give me all the crumbs. So highly recommend this series, and especially if you're into really interesting world building and political intrigue. And lastly, this brings us to the final book on this list of recommendations and my favorite fantasies with romantic subplots. And this last one is truly the most subplot of them all. Like, it's so subtle that it took me a while to even realize that it was there. This one is definitely the most focused on story and plot, and is anybody surprised? It's of course Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I don't know if there is a single video where I haven't talked about this book, and I will not stop until I get more and more people to read it. So let's do this again. This book is about these two neighboring countries that are at war with one another, and the country that our main character Emily is from has turned to conscription to try to get enough soldiers to join the fight. But eventually even that is not enough, and they turn to drafting women into the war, and Emily ends up becoming one of them. And the story follows Emily as she is brought to the front lines and the brief training that she and the other women endure, and eventually being forced into battle. And it not only shows you the brutalities of war and the battles themselves, but also just the everyday horrors of being a soldier. And there is a lot more to this war than meets the eye. So that is the main premise of this book, and of course I love the way that Adrian Tchaikovsky writes about the battles and the struggles and the themes that he explores. But I admit that it is definitely the romance that really sold this book for me. And it's so funny that I say that because, like I said, it really is just like the tiniest footnote of a romantic subplot, and I didn't even know that the love interest was supposed to be a love interest for like the longest time. So I was just like sitting there reading this and being like, I don't know who this guy is. I don't really know how I'm supposed to feel about him. Like, whatever, he's just there. And then later on, it just hit me all of a sudden, like, oh, he's supposed to be the love interest. And that's not to say that he's like a bad guy or someone that's hard to root for or something. In fact, I really love the way that it's done because of the subtlety of everything and the way it just snuck up on me. And this is truly hate to love at its finest, because Emily does really hate him in the beginning, and for very good reasons. But as they get to know each other and interact more, her barriers slowly start to break down, and there could almost be something between them, but then something else happens that reverts all their progress, and then Emily is shipped off to war, and it's just so angsty in all the best, tragic, heart-wrenching ways possible. And I cried so much reading this book at just like the tiniest things, and they'll be writing letters to each other and every single line would have me just dying. And I don't know if there's just something wrong with me, because I haven't really heard anyone else talk about the romance in this book book this way, so it might just be me, but I absolutely loved it. This is like the blueprint of what I want in a romantic subplot in such a great story. So yeah, as far as romantic subplots go, this one is definitely one of my favorites of all time, and this book is one of my favorite books of all time. And in case I haven't mentioned it, this is a historical fantasy standalone, so you don't have to worry about having to pick up a whole series. Everything is just contained in this one single volume, and it's also just like the most delicious slow burn as well. So there we have it. Those were my 7 recommendations for my favorite romantic subplots in fantasies, or favorite fantasies with romantic subplots. This is definitely my preferred way of enjoying romance and fantasies. I'm still trying to find like a fantasy romance or romantasy that can give me the same kind of feelings that any of these books have, but unfortunately that goal still remains unaccomplished. So let me know in the comments some of your favorite romantic subplots in fantasy, or if you have any fantasy romance recommendations for me. And that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again in my next one. Bye!